300 years before the Sith returned to Republic space and the start of the Great Galactic War, a Sith pureblood who chose the name of Lord Scourge would establish himself as a rising star. Raised under the rule of Sith Emperor Vitiate and enrolled in the Sith Academy until adulthood, Scourge quickly made a name for himself, noted as a prodigal lightsaber duelist and an expert interrogator. Upon graduation, he was initially relegated to low-level assignments and campaigns along the Imperial frontier, though he was eventually recalled to the Sith capital world, Dromund Kaas, by order of Emperor Vitiate himself, assigned to the protection of the Dark Council Master Darth Nihilus. Scourge's initial mandate was to investigate the assassination attempts against her, though he soon discovered that they were nothing more than a ruse crafted by Nihilus, who was attempting to bring down another rival on the Sith Dark Council. Having proved his worth, Darth Nihilus confided in him, expressing her desire to overthrow Emperor Vitiate due to his eventual plans to devour all life to feed his power. Scourge joined in her schemes and served her faithfully for several years, though he eventually came to question her resolve, ultimately exposing her treachery to the Emperor. In turn, he would also betray the Jedi Exile and Revan, who also attempted to overthrow Vitiate. For his loyalty, Vitiate made Lord Scourge his primary enforcer, granting him the title of the Emperor's Wrath. Through arcane Sith alchemy, Vitiate extended Scourge's life to an unnatural degree. However, Scourge remained committed to overthrowing his emperor and bided his time, serving Vitiate faithfully for over 3 centuries, all the while awaiting the individual that he foresaw would destroy the emperor. When he first met the hero of Tython, he knew the time had come. Together, the hero and Scourge would depose the emperor, Scourge being honored with the Republic's Cross of Glory. Unable to return to the Sith and unwilling to join the Jedi, Scourge remained a reluctant member of the hero's party, and his ultimate fate is unknown. Almost a millennia after the Battle of Ruusan, during the waning decades of the Old Republic, Rahm Kota would establish himself as an undaunted Republic loyalist, though also as a staunch militant. This aggressive worldview stemmed from his upbringing as a child soldier on his war-torn homeworld, where he was forced onto the battlefield before the age of 10. When Kota was 18, he met Jedi Master Mace Windu, who had been dispatched to negotiate a peace settlement. When the mission was completed, Windu brought Kota back to the Jedi Temple with him, where his latent Force talents could be honed under Master Yoda, making Kota one of the rare exceptions to the Jedi Order's policy of only accepting young children for training. Few bonded with the gruff Rahm Kota, and he frequently questioned the actions of the Jedi Council, though his commitment to the Jedi Order was beyond question. When the Clone Wars began, Kota established himself as an absolute military genius, though his distrust of the Republic clone troopers led him to assemble his own militia. These misgivings ultimately saved Kota's life. While the rest of the Jedi Order was butchered by their own soldiers, Kota escaped and went into hiding. Though Kota laid low for well over a decade, he was not idle, and he eventually came out and started openly attacking various Imperial military installations in an attempt to provoke a confrontation with Darth Vader. Instead, he was faced by Vader's apprentice, codenamed Starkiller, who defeated him above Nar Shaddaa. Left blind and broken after the battle, Kota lost heart, hopping cantina to cantina as a simple drunk. Kota's attempted suicide by alcohol poisoning would be interrupted by Starkiller, who recruited Kota as part of his mission to rally the various opponents of the Galactic Empire into a unified rebellion. His experiences with Starkiller helped Kota regain his fighting spirit. And when the alliance to restore the Republic was officially formed, he stepped up as one of their primary military leaders, though Starkiller perished on board the Death Star. As a rebel general, Kota would push for a major strike at the Empire, his efforts culminating in an attack on the Empire's cloning facilities on Kamino, where the rebels managed to successfully capture Darth Vader, all with the aid of an unstable clone of Starkiller created by the Sith Lord. The Rebel Alliance would eventually defeat the Galactic Empire and reform the Republic, though Rahm Kota's ultimate fate is unknown. Hello, YouTube! This is Gensarai1, though I am sad to report that although originally marketed as such, this video is no longer a collaboration between myself and Antoine Bandele. After the delays imposed by the copyright strike against my channel, he simply got too tied up with his own projects to really have time to get this going again. So I decided to carry on without him, and I will be presenting Lord Scourge vs. Rahm Kota. Originally, we were going to be working on Qui-Gon Jinn vs. Rahm Kota, but Antoine wanted to switch over to Scourge after reading Revan. While I despise that book with a vengeance, I have nothing but praise for the character of Lord Scourge, and his more diverse skill set made for a more interesting matchup, so I was game. To be clear, I am focusing on Lord Scourge within the time frame of the novel, as the version of the character presented in the Old Republic MMO is considered a valid threat to top-tier council masters within both the Jedi and Sith orders, and is therefore far beyond Kota's ability to handle. So now, with all of that out of the way, let us proceed with Lord Scourge, the Emperor's Wrath, versus Rahm Kota, the Jedi Insurgent. Sith purebloods were originally native to Korriban, though Scourge himself was born off-world, and they were distinguished by their deep red skin tone, facial tendrils, and bone spurs protruding from many of their joints. Their symbiotic relationship with the dark side of the Force resulted in a high percentage of natural Force sensitives, to the point where individuals lacking this trait were regarded as impaired. A warrior race with a history of savagery, the purebloods comprised the ruling class of the Sith Empire. When taken on as Emperor Vitiate's primary lieutenant and enforcer, Lord Scourge was subjected to Sith rituals and alchemy in order to prolong his life, allowing him to siphon power from Vitiate himself. However, this came at great cost. Though he gained immortality, he was plagued by constant internal pain that effectively blocked out all of his senses. As the pain faded, he was left empty, his humanity traded for eternal life and power. However, during his term of service under Darth Nihilus, his biology was more conventional. Despite this, he remained an exceptional example of his species, matching the imposing physical stature boasted by the likes of Darth Malgus and Darth Bane. As a Sith warrior of the Old Empire, Scourge's body was his temple. If he wasn't honing his physical capabilities on the battlefield, he was training and exercising. As quoted from the novel, he rarely went more than 2 or 3 days without practicing his drills, knowing that his continued survival would often depend on his martial expertise. Scourge's body was his livelihood. Unlike his contemporaries, the Sith Inquisitors, who focused on their use of the Force, his capabilities came from physical might. In this, he demonstrated impressive levels of both strength and resiliency. He has been seen tanking the effects of Force lightning, shrugging off blaster wounds to his shoulder and suffering through broken ribs. In fact, just after breaking his ribs, he was able to take on a horde of assassin droids. The latter feat was especially impressive, as Scourge was lacking for stamina when facing non-organic adversaries. Most of his power, especially in the realm of physical augmentation, came from his natural skill with Consume Essence, an ability which allowed him to feed off of the passionate emotions of his enemy. When no such passions existed, he had nothing to draw from, and his energy reserves dwindled very quickly, especially when he was forced to rely on physically demanding strength-based attacks. Though this was a weakness for Scourge prior to his appointment to Darth Nihilus' entourage, it can be assumed that he worked to overcome this deficiency during his time in her service. It would be more advantageous for a battlefield warrior to be viable in prolonged extended battles. But be that as it may, Lord Scourge was shuffled to bodyguard duties and did not participate in many open battles. Instead, he was usually pitted against the individual or small groups of assassins who attempted to attack his charges. As was typical of a wartime Sith warrior, Scourge wore heavy armor that protected his vital areas, large shoulder pauldrons to deflect overhand cleaves, heavy gauntlets to protect his hands, greaves and raised knee guards encasing his lower legs, and beneath it all a ribbed bodysuit fitted with electronics. The armor provided a near-total protection against blaster fire, while the plates could resist lightsaber strikes. In combat, Scourge relied on his armor to tank damage, shrugging off direct hits and continuing to press on. In any event, Lord Scourge was a Sith warrior at the top of his class. While he may have had poor stamina in specific scenarios, he more than made up for it in his raw, unabated tenacity. Though the original homeworld of humanity is lost to time, humans were the most common species in the galaxy, the standard against which all others were judged. Though biologically consistent, they varied widely in size and appearance. In the case of Rahm Kota, he stood at 6'4", or 1.93 meters for those of you who use metric. Though his age is unspecified, he was likely in his 50s, and he showed every minute of those decades in his scarred countenance. I'm going to start off this analysis by quoting Rahm Kota's entry on the databank presented in The Force Unleashed 2. Medical examiners report, following the General's captivity on Cato Neimoidia, General Kota was in dire condition upon his arrival in Medical Bay 6. Our initial examination revealed the following injuries: 17 fractured bones, 14 Class 2 lacerations, 6 Class 3 lacerations, 2 Class 4 lacerations, moderate abdominal hemorrhaging, severe concussion, 5 missing teeth. Treatment for all of his injuries was hastily administered. While the General is expected to make a full recovery, I suspect he was never in any real danger. He seemed cognizant and fully in control of his faculties during every procedure. Deep tissue scans indicated multiple previous severe injuries with no evidence of any prior medical intervention. While I don't purport to have any understanding of the so-called Force, it remains my only explanation for the General's astonishing resiliency. Addressing Kota's feats more directly, he fought continuously in the Tarko Se arena on Cato Neimoidia for 7 days against all manner of vicious creatures and bloodthirsty killers, sustained numerous severe injuries, and still had plenty of fight left in him. Despite being an older man, Kota has managed to hold on to a truly prodigious level of physical ability, his only significant weakness being his blindness, having had his eyes burned out by a lightsaber blade during his duel with Galen Marek. However, Kota did have his limits. While he could engage conventional soldiers and wild animals almost indefinitely, the demands of a contest with an opposing Force wielder would start to wear on him, fatigue being one of the main contributing factors to his defeat at Marek's hands. He can tank huge amounts of injury, but he can be beaten into submission, folding under Marek's onslaught. He is also not proof against the sort of unconventional weaponry that Jedi have proven vulnerable to in the past, such as sonic grenades. Unlike many other Jedi, Rahm Kota opted for body armor, specifically a breastplate and pauldrons, likely composed of simple durasteel. For most of his career, the breastplate was front-side only, but after his escape from Cato Neimoidia, he replaced it with a full cuirass, with both breast and back plates. His original armor evidently possessed a limited ability to withstand lightsaber hits, as the TFU novelization described one of his pauldrons as glowing red-hot by the end of his duel with Galen Marek, indicating that he had been subjected to multiple lightsaber hits, though it's not established what the capacity for his new armor is. There is no denying that both of these combatants are absolute physical tanks, both dishing out and shrugging off absolutely inhuman amounts of punishment. Both have soldiered on in the face of overwhelming odds, continuing to move forward where others have broken. But because both are so resilient and tenacious, neither has any major advantage over the other, and they match one another quite neatly. However, this equilibrium was offset, however slightly, by their armor. While Kota's armor could absorb similar levels of punishment, it was not a full suit, and there were plenty of vulnerable gaps, where Scourge's armor set provides more complete coverage. As slight as this advantage may be, it provides Lord Scourge with an edge in regards to physical capabilities. Lord Scourge was noted for his great intellect and perception in the Force, but like all other combat-oriented Sith warriors, his use of its power was as an extension of his martial skill. As a result, Force-based physical augmentation was his primary and most viable power, enhancing his reflexes and movements to a superhuman level. He would employ telekinesis almost as an exclamation point to his lightsaber sequences, capable of breaking bones and shattering skulls. While he could use his abilities with precision, often utilizing well-placed and concise lightsaber throws, he typically employed them as a blunt instrument. Scourge is bizarrely distinguished for having never made use of Force lightning, a consistent attribute even during his 300 years of service to Emperor Vitiate. An explanation for this may just be his utilitarianism, expressed through his simple but effective use of the Force. Emphasizing combative abilities, he used his powers like a battering ram, primarily focusing on martial arts abilities. He was similar to Mace Windu, in that he often showcased his dueling abilities while keeping his Force abilities in reserve, though he was entirely capable of breaking them out when necessary. As war with the Jedi would not begin for another 300 years, Scourge spent much of his early career ironically as a Sith hunter, which of course made strong telekinetic defenses an absolute necessity in order to defend against the Force attacks employed by Sith Inquisitors. Though Vitiate could penetrate Scourge's Force wall with clear ease, this should not be counted against him, as Vitiate has steamrolled many opponents more powerful than Scourge. Of course, his mastery of the Force would lead to a passive Force wall, which allowed him to defend himself against the Force attacks utilized by the Sith Inquisitors and Jedi Consulars that he would face during his 300-year term of service. Over the course of this period, Scourge would add more obscure uses of the Force, such as fear and cloak, to his skill set. He could expel an invisible energy that could strike terror into his opponents' hearts. Even the Dark Council did not oppose him. He could cloak himself in the Force, hiding his presence from other Force sensitives. Though he would not develop these powers until significantly later, they stand as strong indicators of his potential as a Force wielder. Arguably, Scourge's greatest ability with the Force would come in the way of his dark side channeling. A naturally skilled practitioner of consume essence, Lord Scourge gorged himself with the energies of rage and aggression, notably external passions from his foe. His use of this power was so great that he almost became overly reliant on it, which compromised his effectiveness against non-sentient beings and droids. as well as those who kept a handle on their emotions. Essentially, he would possess a substantial advantage against a passionately aggressive foe like Darth Maul, but he would have serious issues against a block of ice like Dooku. This is highlighted in his fight with the Dark Council Master, Darth Zedrix. During their fight, Scourge was unable to draw on his opponent's passion, as the disciplined Sith Master was holding in his rage until he let it out in the form of Sith lightning. However, while it's not explicitly stated, it is heavily implied that his tutelage under Darth Nihilus allowed him to overcome this weakness, learning to draw his power and emotion from within rather than relying on an external source. Based on his feats towards the end of Revan and his appearances in the Old Republic MMO, especially with regards to his accolades, I find it safe to assume that his efforts in this regard were successful, his inner strength allowing him to hold on to his role as the Emperor's Wrath for 3 centuries. This would all be brought together by his Force senses. As a Sith interrogator, he would be adept at assessing his opponents and victims. This would extend to his skills in precognition, able to perceive his foes' moves before they were used against him. In fact, his powers in this area would extend into an ability to experience visions of the future, which allowed him to foresee Emperor Vitiate's ultimate defeat at the hands of the hero of Tython over 3 centuries in advance. Although Scourge was not a dedicated or specialized Force wielder, he used his power to devastating effect, unleashing powerful Force pushes and waves to highlight and augment his lightsaber moveset. Force Sense and Consume Essence would further bolster his combat effectiveness, earning him the title of the Emperor's Wrath and ultimately a reputation as one of the greatest Sith warriors in the galaxy.
Rahm Kota was also a combat specialist first and foremost, and the way he developed and employed his Force abilities reflected this. Given the superhuman physical tolerance described in his medical report, which I will be presenting later, physical augmentation was clearly a huge priority for him. A common and necessary skill amongst all Force-wielding martial artists, it provided him with the enhanced agility and reflexes needed for the study and practice of Jedi martial arts, and as noted, allowed him to shrug off horrendous injuries, improving his long-term viability. His application of telekinesis followed this trend. While his various telekinetic attacks were quite useful in single combat, they were clearly developed with the open battlefield in mind. Powerful waves, pushes, and repulses allowed him to scatter massed groups of enemies, and Force throws allowed him to use the debris created by these devastating area effect abilities as lethal projectiles. However, not all of Kota's attacks were so blunt, as he has been noted for his precision lightsaber throws. He also supplemented these various offensive abilities with a strong defense. His active Force shield was not only an effective defense against telekinetic attacks, but it could also repel physical and energy-based attacks, up to and including lightsaber strikes. In fact, one of his preferred tactics was to use this barrier to protect himself while he peppered the enemy with thrown objects, further demonstrating the mixture of offense and defense that was at the core of his approach and his skill for combative multitasking. Though he was ragdolled with clear ease by Darth Vader, I see this as a demonstration of Vader's superior power rather than any weakness on Kota's part, and I feel confident saying that against Force adepts of his own caliber, Kota's passive barriers would be perfectly adequate. His skill with defensive powers did not end with telekinesis, as he was a capable user of Tutaminis, using this ability to absorb and redirect Galen Merrick's Force lightning during their duel. However, he was incapable of manipulating lightning without harm to himself, being forced to tank the damage rather than negating it completely, and he was absolutely helpless against the high-energy barrages that the Sith Master can unleash. In Kota's defense, the ability to employ Tutaminis in any capacity was a sign of great skill and power, and his knowledge of the obscure and the arcane did not end there. He possessed the gift of farsight, and would experience visions of the future under certain circumstances. On a more practical level, he developed and mastered foresight, using this ability to approximate eyesight after he was blinded. His reliance on this power came with pros and cons. He could only perceive things that had a presence in the Force, which allowed him to see cloaked or concealed enemies, but left him virtually blind to droids or holograms. In summary, Rahm Kota was a highly developed and extremely effective combative Force wielder, and truly earned the title of Jedi Master. While Kota was not the most powerful player on the field, do remember that this is the man who caught Emperor Palpatine off guard, penetrating the telekinetic barriers of the most powerful living Darksider and stealing his lightsaber. Clearly, he was a force to be reckoned with.
Lord Scourge and Rahm Kota are both combat-oriented force battering rams who employ various common powers to a very similar degree. However, in all areas, Kota has greater refinement and a broader range of application. Both have perfected the use of powerful direct telekinetic strikes, but Kota has added to this with his skillful use of force throws and barriers, maximizing his tactical viability. Additionally, Rahm Kota's reliance on foresight made him a living embodiment of Obi-Wan Kenobi's words to Luke Skywalker.
Your eyes can deceive you, don't trust them.
To a true Jedi, physical blindness is not blindness at all, and in fact a reliance on foresight brings with it many tactical advantages, especially in a confrontation with another Force wielder, as he would be perceiving movements in the Force with the same ease with which you or I can perceive a puppet dancing on its strings, giving him a split-second advantage. Their alternative powers are essentially a non-issue. Scourge's consume essence is marginalized by Kota's emotional control. Intense, passionate emotion is something that the Sith prize and encourage, which gives Scourge a significant advantage when pitted against other Sith Lords, his power allowing him to use their greatest strength against them. However, the value of this ability is severely diminished when facing a Jedi, as they are all about restraining and controlling their emotions as opposed to riding them. This is something that holds true even when dealing with aggressive militants like Rahm Kota, who has proven that he can keep a lid on it. Kota's skill with Tuta Minis is redundant as Scourge doesn't use lightning. I must stress that Kota's advantages are not game breakers for Scourge, who is still powerful and skilled enough to compete. However, there is no questioning that Kota's greater refinement and versatility makes him more viable, even if only slightly. Rahm Kota gets the edge as a Force wielder. Lord Scourge's lightsaber followed the typical Sith warrior mold, brutal and utilitarian, form-reflecting function. The emitter was flanked by two upward-turned blade guards, no doubt sharpened at the edges, while the pommel was fitted with a large spike, adding to the weapon's lethality. As per Sith tradition, the weapon was fitted with a red-hued synthetic crystal, which are known to generate blades with greater cutting power, albeit at the cost of reduced handling. The lightsaber, like Scourge himself, was a purpose-built death dealer, dedicated to killing the enemy as efficiently as possible. And as stated in the novel Revan, Scourge was an expert swordsman. During his prime as the Emperor's Wrath, he fought the hero of Tython to a stalemate, and was feared even by the Sith Dark Council, responsible for the deaths of approximately 100 Jedi and at least 10 times as many Sith. Even at this early stage in his development, Scourge was a force to be reckoned with. As an apprentice at the Sith Academy, many of his instructors were reluctant to spar with him due to his skills. Throughout his tenure under Darth Nihilus, he fought against several notable Sith, up to and including Emperor Vitiate's personal guard. By his own assessment, he stood equal to the Jedi Exile. As an expert duelist, Scourge was a practitioner of Juyo, the final and most demanding form of lightsaber combat. built around randomized staccato blade work executed in unpredictable chaotic bursts and driven by intense focused emotion, which left dedicated practitioners of the art skirting dangerously close to the dark side of the Force. Juyo was the most deadly and dangerous of the lightsaber forms. Among the Sith, Juyo was revered as the ultimate expression of the dark side through physical combat. Because of these demands, the training and study of Form 7 was only provided to the most talented and disciplined students, the prerequisite being mastery of several other fighting forms. Scourge would display a proficiency for both Form 4 Ataru and Form 3 Surisu. Ataru no doubt informed the complex staccato movements of Juyo, the elaborate flourishes of Form 4 feeding into the erratic sequences of Form 7. However, Ataru was more flowing and less erratic, where Juyo was marked by seemingly unconnected sequences with precision strikes. I believe this precision was derived from Scourge's use of Surisu. Though Surisu is noted for its defensive principles, its primary attribute was tight and efficient movement. But instead of applying these minimalist move sets to defense, he applied them to his offense. In this marriage of Ataru and Surisu, he replicated the basic principles of Juyo. This would be highlighted most clearly in his fight against Darth Zedrix and his two Sith acolytes. What was most impressive was how seamlessly Scourge could alternate between the two forms despite their stark differences, adjusting his overall style by emphasizing different techniques. His typical mode of operation was to open up with a defensive posture, transitioning into an offensive flurry only when he saw an opening. This runs directly in line with Scourge's general personality. Though capable of becoming a rage-filled maelstrom, he was generally quite calculating and attentive. When dealing with Darth Nihilus, Emperor Vitiate, and the other Dark Council members, he chose all of his battles carefully and cautiously, whether physical, mental, or political. In all situations, he was utterly ruthless, yet attentive enough to know when to pull back. Essentially, he only picked the battles that he stood a good chance of winning, whether the prize was his foe's death or the information they held. While this is an intelligent way to conduct oneself in both daily proceedings and in battle, it did leave Scourge much too cautious, to the point where he lacked a certain self-confidence. This apprehension would extend to his ability to channel the dark side. As a young warrior before his tenure as the Emperor's Wrath, he would have trouble finding power within himself, instead being overly reliant on the passions of his opponent, as was discussed in the Force Abilities round. However, his tutelage under Darth Nihilus allowed him to overcome this weakness, finding strength within himself. Though Scourge began as merely a talented duelist, he propelled himself to the top of the Sith Order, the personal guard of his monarch, the wrath of the Empire.
Over the course of his personal insurrection against the Empire and the subsequent galactic civil war, Rahm Kota carried at least 2 lightsabers. The original was taken from him by Galen Marek after his defeat on board the TIE Fighter construction shipyard above Nar Shaddaa, necessitating a replacement, which followed the same design as the original. Solidly constructed and featuring a heavy emitter shroud, the many scratches and pits in the alloy casing attesting to the heavy-duty make of the weapon. Leather wrapping made up the hand grip. Mechanically, the lightsaber was fitted with a green focusing gem, no doubt an Adagan crystal obtained on Ilum. Much like the man himself, Rahm Kota's lightsaber was built for war. As such a militant Jedi, it really is no surprise that Rahm Kota developed into such a formidable and highly experienced swordsman. His character sheet in the Force Unleashed campaign guide listed his chosen martial art as Juyo. While the intense emotional demands of Form 7 made it a staple amongst the Sith Lords, the training and study of the art was harshly regulated amongst the Jedi, as more than once it has triggered an initiate's fall to the dark side of the Force. As previously mentioned, only high-level masters of multiple disciplines could hope to harness the power of Juyo. As I have stated elsewhere, this last prerequisite is what intrigues me the most, because it means that no two applications would ever be the same, because all of the students of the art are approaching it with completely different backgrounds and skill sets. Though this is pure conjecture, in the case of Rahm Kota, I believe his application of the style was built on the backs of Shicho and Shien. Form 1 Shicho was the tutorial style of the Jedi Order, emphasizing simplistic techniques and disciplines, focuses which made it a good fallback option when more elaborate fighting styles were inappropriate. Simply put, it's crowd control. Form 5 Shien was a development on the Surisu form, and was similarly geared towards blast deflection, but where Surisu was focused entirely on defense, Shien was designed to use targeted deflections as a form of counterattack. The description of Kota's personal fighting style in the Force Unleashed novelization contained many elements consistent with Forms 1 and 5, and the sort of techniques emphasized by both would make them practical choices for a battlefield-oriented Jedi like Kota. Furthermore, both forms evolved into extremely domineering and emotionally charged disciplines when taken to their respective nth degrees, which would have provided him with a background in the sort of emotional control that he would need to perfect as a student of Juyo. Rahm Kota was a strong fighter who effectively balanced out and alternated between powerful offensive frenzies and more sustainable slow and steady assaults, cutting loose without losing control and maintaining his flexibility as a duelist. His personal technique was very dynamic, backing up rapidly executed offensive strikes with deft acrobatics, combat rolls, and powerfully aggressive charges, while his defensive skills left him well equipped to both deflect and stonewall adversaries, further reinforced by acrobatic evasions. While his technique was largely optimized for large-scale battles and skirmishes, he has proven his mettle as a duelist, his tactics in such situations being best described in his entry in the TFU official game guide, and I quote, "In one-on-one combat, Kota generally adopts a defensive stance, using his lightsaber skills and mastery of the Force to protect himself until he can launch a devastating counterattack." In addition to perfectly meshing with the typical Form 5 tactic of following up defensive maneuvers with immediate counters, what is also described here is his skill at integrating his Force abilities into his lightsaber sequences, employing all of his powers as part of a broader overall fighting method. As a military leader first and foremost, Kota's approach to battle would have been based around preparation, simply because that is what military leaders do. When it comes to managing large numbers of troops in a combat situation, only a fool goes in without a plan. However, unlike other preparation-centric Jedi, such as Luminara Unduli, who is generally left scrambling when dropped into a situation cold, Kota has proven that he can make strategic assessments and build a plan of attack in situ. In fact, I would argue that his initial defensive response is intended to goad his opponent into making the first move so he can gauge their capabilities. This mixture of preparation and adaptability was the crux of Rahm Kota's overall approach to battle. While not an experienced duelist, he was an experienced warrior. While not a great swordmaster, he was a master in his own right. A dedicated and pragmatic battlefield Jedi, and a true force to be reckoned with.
For all of their power in the Force and physical might, the deciding element in a confrontation between Lord Scourge and Rahm Kota is skill with the lightsaber. On the surface, one may think this battle would look very similar to Darth Sidious versus Maul, two Juyo masters ripping into each other with pure dedicated offense. However, Scourge and Kota were two extremely conservative fighters, keeping their full strength in reserve until they were confident in their assault, gauging their opponents before cutting loose. In regards to how their physical techniques stacked up against each other, their performance levels were very similar, but Scourge's technique was more layered. Though a student of the ferocity form, Kota's application and technique was more easily compared to the determination form. The direct simplicity at the core of Kota's style made it very adaptable, easy to remember and execute even when under duress. But this uncomplicated approach wasn't well suited for confusing or bypassing a staunch defense. For Scourge, his skill in Surisu provided him with the same staunch general-purpose defense that Kota boasted, while the combination of Ataru and Juyo provided him with more attack options, which he used to bewilder and overwhelm the defenses of opponents. Though the effectiveness of such an elaborate style could be reduced by breaking the fighter's composure, Scourge was so disciplined that this simply wasn't an issue. Though their lightsaber skills are easily comparable, there is no questioning Scourge's overall supremacy in this field. One point that I must stress is that Scourge's advantage is not the result of skill but of emphasis. Scourge's primary role was that of enforcer and bodyguard, his field of expertise being single combat or small skirmishes. Even before his tenure as the Emperor's Wrath, Scourge was a veteran duelist with plenty of kills under his belt. This experience meaning that he would have been exposed to numerous variations of lightsaber combat. As a battlefield Jedi, this is experience that Kota does not share, his assets being a keen tactical mind and a consistent level of performance in all areas, rather than an absolute understanding of blade-to-blade combat. Technically speaking, both can handle everything that the other is bringing to the table, and both can make the necessary adjustments to adapt to anything new. But Scourge's experience and insight means that he can do so more quickly, even if only slightly. However, though lightsaber skills would be the deciding factor in this confrontation, force abilities would still play a major role. Scourge's advantage as a swordsman is only by a very slim margin, and wouldn't be immediately apparent, so they would both resort to their secondary talents to give them a boost against such an evenly matched opponent. As I outlined earlier, Kota's mastery of Force Sight allows him to immediately perceive movements in the Force, giving him a split-second advantage when defending against the Force attacks of an opponent, and his more developed telekinesis simply provides him with more attack options. The main reason why Kota can't score an early victory by simply overwhelming Scourge with the Force is because of their physical resiliency. Battering someone into submission with blunt force trauma is not a reliable means of subduing someone quickly, especially not when compared to a lightsaber strike. By inches, by centimeters, Rahm Kota would be cut through, a subtle variation executed with pinpoint precision, allowing Scourge to find a gap in the Jedi Master's defenses. Thus, I declare Lord Scourge, the Emperor's Wrath, the victor.